Hey, can you hear me, Jordan?
Yeah, I can. Hey, Zach, how are you?
Good, good. How about yourself?
Doing well, doing well. How are you?
Good, good.
Good.
Can't complain.
Yeah. I really want to thank you for doing this with me. I really
Yeah,
appreciate you talking with me. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say.
awesome. No, thanks. I love doing the console call, so thanks for signing up.
Yeah, no problem at all. Uh, just want to start off. How was Desert Solstice there? What did you think of that?
That was quite an experience. I had some pretty big goals for that one, and it just like I had like a whole series of things kind of go wrong for me on the day, but ultimately I stayed out there for the full 24 hours, which was like the number one goal to just experience the full 24 since I hadn't done that complete event before.
Sure.
Um, but yeah, I had like, I might have overcooked myself a little bit in training. I didn't really realize it probably till around 4 or 5 hours in. But ultimately, what really slowed me down was I had like a series of issues with my left leg
Mm,
from like a cramp in my left calf that kind of spread up into my hamstring for a bit. And it took me like quite a while to get that straightened out. And once I did, and kind of got rolling again, then I had like a pain in my left hip that kind of felt like where the IT band connects up there.
yeah, yeah.
I couldn't get it to, and at that point it was like 36, 37 degrees at night in the desert. So it was like I found myself like stopping and like trying to massage it out and warm it up as often as I could just to keep it loose enough. And so I basically ended up walking the last 12 hours. But
Yeah,
so it was quite an experience, but at least something to build off of for a future attempt.
for sure. I gotta ask, really, how does one keep their sanity in check when they're running around the same loop for 4 hours? I have one of the guys that I work with, he did a 24-hour event up in Toledo, and it was like a 1.1 mile loop. And I can't wrap my head around, like, what do you focus on? How do you keep your mental faculties in check?
Yeah, that's the hardest part, I think, is just staying motivated when like essentially you've seen the entire thing like very early on. And I've kind of figured out what works well for me in like slightly shorter ones, like 12-hour type events.
Sure.
Um, it was a little different because I was hoping to be running the entire time. So I feel like it'd maybe be a little bit of a different like focus if I had to do that versus just trying to survive like I did on Saturday.
Yeah.
But I got a peek into that. And I think that's going to, you get to that point where you're like, you've been out there for like 18, 19 hours and you've been out there forever seemingly, and then you still got a long ways to go. That's
Yeah.
kind of a daunting spot. So I think really what you got to do though is get really good at just kind of like micro progressions and just like focusing on like small little goals and have enough of that kind of built into kind of your strategy so that you're never kind of thinking of the entirety at once, because that's just going to overwhelm you and get you thinking negatively.
Sure.
So yeah, because anytime you go down like a negative mental space, it's like like the number of excuses that pop into your head to
Oh,
stop and
yeah.
slow down is just infinite. So
Yeah.
you have to almost just kind of know that going in, I think, and kind of plan around it a little bit. But I mean, everyone's a little different, and I mean, it's hard to do. I mean, even this year, so Desert Solstice is an invitational, which is the assumption is that like there's some of the best at that type of an event, and even like any year at Desert Solstice, they'll start with like sometimes upwards to 50 people, and by the time you get to the next morning, it's whittled down to like 4 or 5 people on the track sometimes. So
Yeah.
um, only one person out there I would say actually like really kind of stayed consistent the entire day. Even the guy who won kind of blew up a bit at the end and spent a good bit of the last couple hours walking.
Yeah.
Leading female too, she had like this like there's this weird situation that happens in ultra running. They don't really know exactly what's going on, but you like start to kind of lean to the side.
Hmm.
And at first it's just like super like just it almost looks like it could be like they have a weird form. And then but over the hours it gets to the point where they're like tilted like almost like this. And it's like their one side can't hold them upright. And she started having that kind of set in. And since I was basically walking at that point, I was just, as a coach, I'm watching all these people out there because I'm trying to get ideas about like what's working well, what's not, what are the strategies
Yeah.
that are using. And I noticed she kind of had that little lean going, like maybe 20, 21 hours in. And I was like, oh, maybe that's her form, maybe not, we'll see. And then like by the end though, she was like stopping every like couple hundred meters, having like to like straighten herself up and try to get running again. And it was like you can't, not kind of out of your control. So there's like a lot
So
of weird things.
is it just like a different side per person? Like, is it? That's so interesting. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, because you would think it's from the laps I'm turning on the
Yeah,
track,
yeah,
but it happens in 100 milers all the time too, especially with folks who have like every year at the Western States 100, there'll be someone who's kind of between 24 and 30 hours finishing time. They'll come down to the finish line and they'll be like in that position.
yeah.
Like I guess there's just probably not enough research in the sport in general to know
Sure. Yeah,
a lot about what's going on, but
sure.
that's one they haven't really figured out yet, I don't think. But
Yeah,
it seems weird. Like it almost seems like half their body like has a bit of like paralysis, and those muscles are like no longer able to like hold them upright, and it's
yeah.
like a stabilizer failure or something.
Like I know in swimming, I do triathlon, and I know in swimming, we breathe on like a odd number count. So that way, every
Mm.
time we inhale outside of the water, we're getting stronger with each side. So each side is strengthening evenly. And if you just do one side, well, one side will eventually get stronger than the other side, and you'll be kind of imbalanced in that way.
Mm.
I wonder if that's something similar there, is like, based on however they breathe or whatever their breathing pattern is, maybe they have like a stronger side than another that tends to over
Yeah.
once everything starts to fatigue, and then that side, kind of overpowers the weaker side. That would be interesting to look at. I haven't heard of that before.
Yeah, no, and I'd have to look to see if it's if there's like a consistent lean as to which direction, or if it's like one side or the other, or kind of 50-50. Because
Yeah,
yeah, if it ends up being like one way, then maybe there's a little something else to it. But or it could just be that like, I guess like, I mean, there's more right-handed people than left-handed people, so maybe there's something similar with like leg pattern or something. I don't know
yeah,
that.
exactly. Uh,
Um,
One thing on that I wanted to ask you about, one thing that I do, that I also coach cross country. I coach youth cross country, and one thing that I'll tell them to do is to have like a breathing pattern, kind of like what I'm used to doing in triathlon, where you kind of breathe on like an odd count, so 3 inhales, 2 exhales, or um,
mhm.
something like that. And that I've found on like my longer runs personally helps to kind of keep me focused if I just keep that constant count going in my head over and over again. Have you ever experimented with something like that, or is that something that you've ever done before, or do you just kind of let your breath go and?
Yeah, I mostly just kind of go intuitively with that, but I've seen a lot of stuff kind of coming out on it, and
Mhm.
there's a whole bunch of new research on just like breathing through your mouth versus your nose now too. And I know that's
Yeah,
always kind of been something that's floated around the running sphere in terms of like nasal breathing and stuff, but
yeah,
up until recently, I don't know that they really had any good research on it. But the breathing pattern stuff, I think that got kind of popular too with like the chi running. They would have like a pattern of breathing that was supposed to be um, more. I think it was just when you had that rhythmic breathing, it helped with like your posture and your positioning too. So it was almost like kind of hard to tease out whether it was actually an efficiency from the way you're breathing versus just an efficiency in your form that was creating like a better outcome.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I know it's something maybe I need to dive into a little deeper and do some more
Well, it's
exploring with that.
interesting. It's interesting because if you breathe on an odd count, your exhale, your first exhale alternates between your right foot and your left foot. So you can,
Mm-hmm.
when you get that first exhale and hit on the ground, the side that's hitting the ground first is going to have like a more of a flex reflex when
Mm-hmm.
they'll get that first initial exhale. And so it kind of flops back and forth. It's just something interesting that I noticed, and it helped with like stitches early on when I was learning to run. Breathing on that odd count, I found that I wouldn't get sore on one side or the other because I was switching that exhale from side to side. Have you read James Nestor's book?
No, I haven't. I know who James Nestor is though.
He has that new book on breathing. I can't remember the title right now. It's The Lost Art of Breathing or something like that. I've read it and it's incredible. He did a whole slew of experiments on breathing and breathing in relation to endurance events, and he worked with a lot of guys who are kind of mavericks in the endurance sport world who do kind of funky breathing techniques. And he did this one study, and it was monitored by Stanford. and they were on exercise bikes, and they weren't allowed to breathe through their mouth at all. They had their mouths like taped completely shut, and they were only doing nasal breathing, and they had pulse oximeters on, and their oxygen levels, their blood oxygen levels never dipped below 98%.
Wow.
And they were kind of breathing on these counts, these like odd counts that I was talking about. And it was he and Stanford came up with a number that was like, if you do 5-second inhale, 5-second exhale, it works out to be like you can have the perfect amount of carbon dioxide to oxygen ratio in your body. And super, super interesting stuff to think about there. And because you get some people who run and they breathe like they're about to die, and then other people are calm and relaxed looking, and it's interesting how those differences arise.
Yeah, and what'd you say the name of that book is? I'm gonna write that one down. I know you said James Nestor.
James Nestor, let me look it up. It's
and I can Google it too if you don't.
Yeah, it's like the subtle art of breathing or something.
So it sounds the name sounded familiar the first time you said it. So
Breath. It's called Breath, the New Science of a Lost Art. Man, it's incredible. Rogan did a whole podcast with him where he kind of talks about it. And, obviously the book is way more detailed, but go check out Rogan's podcast with him. It's really, really good. And as soon as I got like 30 minutes into the Rogan podcast with Nestor, and I bought the book immediately. I read it in like 5 days. It's so good.
Okay.
And the information that you'd get from it is incredible.
I'll have to check that out. And I think that's where I heard of that book before, because I had another call with someone like a few weeks back who was asking about that episode, I think, but I hadn't watched it. So I'll have to go back, watch the show and get the book and get myself up to speed.
Yeah, it was blowing my mind. As someone who's been in athletics my whole entire life, it's not even anything I've ever thought of. No one's ever mentioned it. So I'm curious about it now, and I do a lot of looking into it these days and trying to figure out what it's all about. So it's super interesting. I want to kind of change directions a little bit and get into what I really wanted to talk to you about. So I'm a personal trainer, and I train clients who have already been in ultra or are going into ultra. And I wanted to get a feel for, what is your non-running training like? What do you do? Obviously, things that you do now are probably different than things you would have done as you were getting into the sport as a beginner, but what do you do, and how do you set your body up muscularly from a muscular standpoint and stability and mobility standpoint to help yourself have success in these long runs? I mean, you hold 2 world records, and that's insane. And there's no way that, you're immobile and you don't have any strength at all. You have to have some strength to do that. It's insane.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's something I kind of learned, or I started learning about it. It's a little like 5 or 6 years ago, because I had some imbalances. I actually had a race where like you'd see pictures of me at the end of it, and I was kind of falling apart a bit near the end. I had a pretty good day, all things considered, but I definitely didn't have a very good finish. Sure. And like the pictures of me, I was just basically like leaning backwards almost. That's how like broken my form had become.
Yeah.
And it was like my posterior chain. I just got so quad dominant.
Yeah.
So like the first thing I did was I just started with like some basic kind of like posterior chain type lifts, like deadlifting and things like that. And then since that happened, like some of the research around endurance strength training has really evolved quite a bit, because the sport kind of went back and forth for quite a while there, where it was like you'd have a camp that says you should do it, and you had another camp that say, no, it's a waste of time. If you've got time to do strength work, you should be out there running more. Yeah. And it was one of those kind of back and forths. But I think they're starting to realize now that the problem that most people make when they do start strength training with endurance is they kind of focus on what they think is right, where they'll do essentially what they're doing out there running, which is just lightweight, high repetition type stuff. When in reality, they need to kind of get over the phobia of heavy weights and do some of those core kind of fundamental lifts like squats, deadlifts, box jumps. Some people focus a lot on like single leg stuff too, once they kind of develop to the point where they can do it with good form, because a lot of times runners will have an imbalance on one side or the other, and I can probably correct that a lot easier by doing single versus double. But yeah, that kettlebell swings have gotten kind of more popular within the running community as a I guess a little more of a high repetition option. But for me, I focus like mostly on like deadlifts, squats, box jumps, weighted forward lunges. And the way I kind of structure it is, if you break your season into kind of like 3 phases, so you have like your base building, kind of like your primary workouts and like the racing season, I like to go from like maybe 5 sets of like 10 reps on that first third, and then 5 sets of 5 reps in the middle third, and then 5 sets of 3 reps at the end. So I'm actually progressively getting lower in weight or lower in reps.
Higher
and
weight.
Yeah. And the weight, like usually with most runners I work with and myself, I usually try to kind of follow up like about like then leave a couple reps on the table type of a mindset with it.
Don't want to go to failure.
Right. Yeah, because part of it, part of the argument against strength work too was just like you go in the gym and start lifting heavy weights or something. I mean, some of it was ignorance. It was just like, oh, you're going to get bulky. And it's like, yeah, well, if you're running, 70, 80 miles plus per week, then you're probably not going to get bulky from any weightlifting you're doing. But the other part was just, if you go in and hurt yourself pulling weight off the ground, then it's like, what good did you do with a supplementary activity? But yeah, those are the ones that I do from the lower body standpoint. And then core, I'll do like a lot of resisted work. So again, kind of counter to what you see a lot of the runners in the gym probably coming in doing like sit-ups and things like that. I like to do like weighted stuff like cable pulls, lateral cable pulls and things that are going to just really actually strengthen that area. Some planks and things like that too. And then like leg lifts. So like hanging leg lifts are ones I'll do quite a bit as well. For core strength. And I don't do as much lower back stuff. I will from time to time, but most of that just gets addressed with like the deadlifting. Most things in general get addressed with the deadlifting and squatting actually. So usually that's kind of like the starting point I'll use with folks who are new to it, is let's figure out how to get you in a position where you can do a quality deadlift or a quality squat. And, that's going to mostly address the core and all that other stuff, just kind of holding that weight. And it's a pretty low barrier entry too. I think most of the gains they've seen in the more recent research is done with like maybe one trip to the gym per week per like per area. So like you could do lower body once a week and still get most of the benefits from it. Personally, I like going to the gym, so I'll usually do 2 or 3, but it's actually funny that this was the topic I want to talk about, because when I was reflecting on kind of my last training for the 24-hour, I had kind of reached a bit out of where I normally would do for like just a volume standpoint. And it just ate up so much time and energy. I neglected a little bit of my strength work, and, perhaps that's why my whole left leg failed on me.
That it's, and it's interesting too, that what you're talking about it. And you said something that I want to touch on is, you were saying getting someone to a point to set them up to do a proper deadlift. And actually in my most recent client who I brought on, that's kind of the main focus here is taking someone who only has ever ran and hasn't had so much experience with lifting weights, going into the gym and trying to perform like a full deadlift, a conventional deadlift, is actually quite a hard thing to do, and quite a hard thing to do with proper form as well. So it's interesting that you do a lot of the more single leg stuff. And what about the mobility that you personally worked yourself up to do in order to do a full deadlift? Because to do a deadlift properly, if you can do a deadlift properly, it's one of the safest and greatest exercises for anybody, hands down, to be able to do. But to do it improperly is detrimental to your health in general, athlete or not.
Yeah, I think one thing that is, we can talk about the mobility as well, but one thing that is really great, I think, for runners, is if you have like a hex bar, because that just gets them in it's like, it almost, in my opinion, kind of forces them into the right position just by the way it's kind of positioned in there. So, and I, a lot of times, like, when I'm most of the people I coach is remote too. So, being that I don't have a strength training background myself, like if I can get them to go get a trainer and actually work with them, that's like the gold standard. But ultimately, yeah, the mobility side of things is something that I think is really important, because like hip and ankle mobility tends to be pretty weak on runners.
Yeah.
That's an area I noticed, kind of also being I'd have tight hips, very immobile ankles, to the point where like I'd roll my right ankle and it'd be like, have to take like 2 or 3 days off. Whereas, once you get that mobility and strength in that area, you say, now I can roll my ankle over and just keep running that same day. And it's not even really that big of a deal.
Yeah.
But yeah, form and technique plays a role with that too. So I'll do like, there's a couple, I actually had this mobility routine that I started with are you familiar with the Mind Pump Media guys by any chance?
Do they have a YouTube channel?
Yeah, they do like a podcast and a
Yeah.
YouTube, and
I've seen them on YouTube.
Okay. Yeah, they do. They have these programs that they called Maps, and they have a Maps mobility one that I used. And the stuff that worked really well for me was they put you through the full assessment, so you can find out from like head to toe what areas are, less mobile, or, adequate or superior, or whatever. They categorize it in like kind of 3 different ranges. And the stuff that I did for my ankles was basically I would go down and like anchor on the opposite knee of the leg that I was going to try to work on, and then have the other leg out in front and just like work circles with that. And it kind of keep working on that, going both counterclockwise and clockwise. And over time, you can just get like bigger loops. So kind of going in and out on that really helped kind of get that range of motion back for me. And then it was just about, once I got the range of motion back, then the weightlifting, I think kind of, it almost like exponentially improves, because you get the range of motion, then the strength work is more superior. So then that area is strong and mobile versus just being strong or just being mobile.
Yeah.
So that, and just getting out on like varied terrain, that's huge for ankle strength. And it's sometimes an easier way to like get a runner to kind of work on it, is if you get them out on some trails where like there's some like, slightly more technical sections, or at least the trail isn't like perfectly smooth and flat. They're going to get some of that just from running on that on a more regular basis. And that's really helped me being out here in Phoenix now versus where I've lived historically. I've got a lot more access to that type of stuff as well.
I like that you mentioned the Hex Bar Deadlift. I want to give a shout out to someone. I don't know if you know this person or not, or if you've read this research, but do you know Ryan Flaherty?
Yeah.
Over at Nike. So he's the one who really pioneered all that Hex Bar Deadlift routines with runners, and talking about, like the strength to weight ratio and how much force you're applying to the ground on a force plate and how it relates to runners. He took that one marathon runner, I can't remember his name. He was coming out of retirement, and he was a former world-class marathon runner, and knocked like 4 minutes off of his time. He had a new PR by doing these heavy Hex Bar deadlifts and working on that explosiveness. And it's interesting because, like you were talking about, doing more explosive, powerful, strong, low rep lifts. And it's interesting because, like, when you do that, you travel further through the air and you end up taking less steps. You take steps, and that's less impact on your body. And, the advantages from that just kind of cascade upwards. I just wanted to shout out to Ryan Flaherty. Anyone who doesn't know him should definitely go check him out and check out that work that he's been doing with explosive strength training. I mean, from NFL linebackers to marathon runners, it's insane what he's been able to produce, the results he's been able to produce. I like what you were saying about alternating terrain too. I remember in one of the Rogan podcasts, you were talking about how you were really focused on one kind of terrain, and you ended up hurting your sacroiliac that way, right?
Yeah. Well, so yeah, I come off like a pretty long stretch of training on flat, kind of hard surfaces. And then I got into the Western States 100, which has got I think 19,000 feet of climbing and 23,000 feet of descending. So I knew I was going to need to get the climbing and descending skills. And the way I kind of structure my programming a lot of times is I'm doing like the least specific stuff early in the season, and then the most specific stuff as I get closer. So when you're running 100-mile races, that just means the short interval, faster stuff is going to be kind of earlier in the programming.
Yeah.
And I was doing that stuff, but this was just in hindsight kind of a dumb move to begin with, but I was doing some of the speed intervals on downhill. And that's actually when I identified the ankle mobility issues and the hip mobility issues for the first time was after that, from doing that hard downhill running with I didn't have the ankle flexion to probably be able to tolerate that, which probably put me in an awkward position. And then ultimately, at least this is what the doctor theorized based on kind of what I told him. And I had that stress fracture kind of on that tailbone. Thankfully, it wasn't as bad as those ones can be. I think sometimes those, if you get a really good fracture in there, can sideline you for almost a year. But for mine, it was like 5 to 7 weeks of basically no running or very light running until I could kind of start building back up again.
And you thought that your mobility, or you and your doctor had kind of maybe played around with the notion that your mobility and your strength in the hip area was what kind of saved you.
Yeah. Well, the other funny thing too is when that whole process, when I went in, the first thing I thought is I just had a really bad like sciatica. So like we went in and you started doing like active release therapy on it and just trying to really loosen up that area. And after about 3 weeks or so of it just not letting go, he's like, I don't think this is really budging, and there's something else. Maybe we can send you in for an MRI. So I went and got an MRI, and that result came back. I would have been probably about 5 weeks in, came back negative. So, and at the exact same time, I actually, because I would go out maybe 2 or 3 times a week and just kind of like test jog just to see if the pain was there. And it was just such a unique thing where if it was bothering me, I'd know right away. Like I'd go like 4 or 5 steps and I'd feel the pain start already to increase. So I'd stop right away. And right around that same time, I had started to be able to run a couple miles without any pain. And so when I got the negative return, I did maybe like a 5 miler. Then I got a call back from the doctor 2 days later, and he said that they took a second look at the MRI and there actually was a fracture there. So it was weird. It was like, I told him like, I just went for a 5 mile run with no pain, which was by far the most I've been able to do since then. And he said, well, sometimes with the MRIs, it'll show up on there, even if it's like mostly healed, but you can see kind of where that stress fracture was, but we can't really tell if it's like new or if it healed, but that was there. And he also theorized that maybe, because at the same time when I was doing it, I was starting to work on more strength work. And he said maybe what happened was that area was weak, and that's why the fracture was there or occurred. And then the strength work he's been doing for the last 4 or 5 weeks now has been enough to kind of like bolster up that area. So when you go for like, just because I wasn't running hard at all, I was running like really slow, like easy jogging. It was like, you may have built up enough strength over that 4 or 5 weeks that area is just being kind of protected by the stronger muscles in that area now. So you're not feeling that jarring in that spot that's mostly healed. Yeah. But after that, I gave it another couple of weeks just to be safe, and then kind of started building up after that. But yeah. And along that way, we kind of through that whole process, he thought, I actually look at it as kind of a benefit, because I figured out a bunch of things that would have probably plagued me for more years to come had I not recognized them. As one of those things, just kind of normalize it until or something happens that makes you address it. So the ankle and the hip mobility were big ones, and then kind of getting more specific with my strength work, because at that time I'd been doing strength work, but not nearly as specific as I do now.
Sure, yeah. And so you really kind of focused on the mobility and kind of lighter setup strength work. And now that you've covered those bases, you're moving on into the bigger movements and stuff like that. I want to talk about the shoes that you run in Ultra. Those are completely flat shoes with no heel drop. And I personally love running in flat shoes. I don't like the shoes with the heel drop. Would you say that running in Ultras or running in zero drop shoes has helped you or benefited you in a way from a standpoint of running, and whether or not you need a certain degree of ankle mobility to be able to do that, to run in a zero drop shoe?
Yeah, I think I actually got into it pretty early in my ultra running career. So I have a hard comparison in terms of how I would have if I had been having, I ran in high school and college, a standard pair of running shoes that was most likely like 8 to 12 millimeter offset. But around 2011 is when I kind of started working down to zero. And I actually originally worked down all the way to minimalist and was running in minimalist for about a year
Oh
in
yeah.
2013. And then when I partnered up with Ultra, it was like then I had kind of like opportunities of that balanced cushion, but on a variety of different levels of cushioning. So then it was like, okay, I kind of had like a little more of a, like a shoe quiver approach where, there was days where I would do that real low cushion, minimalist type shoe. And then like recovery days when I'm a little sore, I'd maybe add a little cushion. But yeah, I think like having that flat platform, especially on something that's a little more firm, you're just going to probably flex a little more aggressively and really extend that Achilles tendon.
Yeah.
And that's the other conversation I always have to have with people with it too, is like their Achilles tendon, they're worried about that. And, or they'll say, I'm noticing some pain in my Achilles. And it's something that's good. You notice that because you don't want to just go banging out high mileage with that pain there. You will get Achilles tendonitis or something like that. But it should tip you off that, your Achilles tendon is not activating in the full range of motion without pain. That's a weakness. That's not something you want to ignore or band-aid with a shoe.
Yeah.
So I think you'll get more mobility from it. But you'll also, if you're always in like minimalist versions of it, you're also going to really work those lower leg areas a little more, and potentially get maybe a little stiffer if you're doing an aggressive training plan.
Yeah.
I
I started running in Merrill's a couple years ago. So super minimalist, zero drop shoes, almost no padding whatsoever. And exactly what you were saying happened to me. I didn't have enough ankle range of motion to handle that. And I ended up getting Achilles tendonitis and I had to drop out of a 50K that I was training for.
Mm-hmm.
It took me forever to recover from. And I remember going to my doctor and my physical therapist were looking at it and they were like, you have almost no ankle range of motion. Like your foot can hardly flex at all. And it's interesting because I hear all the time, as you surf around the community and all that, people talking about wanting to go to minimalist shoes or zero drop shoes or barefoot or whatever. And people are always asking the same advice about, should I do it? Should I not? And I'm curious, would you say it's something that you should ultimately try to get to, but you have to work on the mobility first to get there? Or what would you say in that question?
Yeah, I think it could maybe work a couple different ways. I think you could just start with the mobility and get that range of motion and then, go right into it and not have to like go back to like an offset. The other way I see work from time to time too is just ease into it so that the mobility almost improves from the running itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be personal. Like if the person has like the capability of having mobile ankles, or they just don't have stiff ankles in general, that might work better for them in terms of getting that Achilles tendon relengthening. Because I always just describe it as kind of like a spring. And if you kind of have that lift in there, you're condensing the spring. So your action that you have available to you is just condensed. So now you come down to this balance. Now you got that full action and you're reusing that area you weren't before. Yeah. So for someone like that, I think it would maybe be like something where like, let's just start you out with a pair on your easy run for the week. And then like, just pay attention to kind of how your foot feels, your lower legs feel after that run. And if they're sore, it's a good sign that we've got some work to do, but we'll just progressively work it up. And ultimately I just tell folks like treat your lower legs and your feet when you're running the same way you would at the gym. Like if like you were doing squats and deadlifts one day, and you're really sore the next day, you're not gonna go to the gym, do squats and deadlifts again. You're probably gonna give yourself a day or two off and then go back and ultimately continually, gradually progress to the point where you're trying to get. Or I'll tell them like treat it like a broken arm where, it's been in a cast for 6 weeks and you take that cast off. You're not just gonna go right back to your next strength training routine. You're gonna ease back into it. And when people start thinking of it like that, then they kind of get into the right mindset, I think, about how they have to be just a little more patient versus 0 to 100.
Yeah. I tend to find that going the route of kind of easing into it or like switching on and off a few days really helps me out a lot. But I just find that like running in the zero drop just feels so much more natural. I don't know what you think, but I think when I run in the zero drop shoes that my form feels way more fluid. I feel like I can get my foot a little bit closer to underneath my center of gravity. I feel like I can plant better and push off better? And, you know, obviously like the wide toe boxes that ultras have and Merrells have, and the
Mhm.
shoes like that have, kind of helps with your toes and the strengthening of your foot. I'm curious as to, do you notice, or did you notice any kind of difference in your form? Did your form change at all when you switched over from a dropped shoe to a zero drop shoe at all?
You know, where I noticed it the most is when I was doing speed work. So
Mhm.
like when I think that was the most pronounced, because the other thing that people don't always think about with those heel raises is you're kind of backloading the weight of the shoe.
Yeah.
So it's not like an even distribution of weight. So it almost like kind of pulls you forward. So the
Yeah.
faster you go, the more, you're going to get that, like that momentum kind of pushing in the wrong direction. And yeah, so I noticed like I was always kind of a mid-foot to forefoot striker, so I could probably get away with a lot more footwear than like the average person could maybe get away with. But with that said, I mean, there was like, if you take like when I'm looking at someone's form, I like to look from the side versus like, because you go into like these running shops, a lot of times they'll like do a gait analysis from behind, and they'll be looking for these like tiny millimeters of pronation, which, don't necessarily mean anything. If the shoe might pronate in, and then you put them in a support shoe, and then their foot still pronates in, but the shoe doesn't. It's like, are you really doing any good at that point?
Yeah.
And you're trying to like microanalyze, versus when you look at them from the side, you can kind of see where that foot is hitting the ground, and whether it's out in front of the bent knee or underneath your bent knee. So one thing I noticed is my foot kind of came back a little bit. So I was striking in roughly the same area of my foot, but it was maybe like an inch further back on where it would
Mhm.
plant in comparison to where my knee was. So ideally it's like if you're turning your legs into their purpose, is that like kind of shock absorber, versus distributing those impact forces into your knees and hips, which I
Yeah.
see all the time when people have, I call it like a check mark stance, where if
Yeah.
they're really overstriding, their toes are pointed
Their
up, their
toes
heels on the
point up.
ground. And it's
Yeah.
just like, the way I sometimes describe to people is like, if you took like a big heavy dictionary and you had like a thin wood pencil, and you stood that pencil straight up and down and put that dictionary on top, that pencil would hold it no problem. But if you tilted to the side and did it, the thing would bend and snap. It's like, that's
Yeah.
what you're doing to your leg when you're kind of
Yeah.
putting it out there like that. It's
Yeah.
all those impact forces are ending up in the wrong spots.
Yeah. And I like that analogy a lot. I use the analogy of like a braking car, because when you have that
Mm-hmm.
form, the forces are acting as a brake. And it's like when you drive in your car, do you want to tap the brake every 5 seconds or something? Like, how would that feel if you just tapping the brake like that? You'd be jarring back and forth, and that would not be a comfortable way to drive at all. That's really interesting. So when you focus on form, on running form from the side, because I take that into consideration a lot when I'm training a runner, is what does their form look like right now, and what kind of strength and mobility do they need to get them to a more efficient form? What are the kind of key factors? I know that they're the normal ones that everyone looks for, but what are your kind of key factors for what you look at in someone's form?
Yeah, so I kind of like a 4 point like system that I try to kind of keep an eye on. And one is like, so I usually start kind of from the head and then work down.
Yeah.
So I'm looking kind of just for like a slight forward lean. And the way I kind
Mhm.
of explain it is like, you don't want to be fighting gravity. So like, you want to almost feel like you're falling forward and catching yourself, and falling forward and catching yourself. So one thing I'll work with someone to kind of understand that is, I'll help them to stand up with as good a posture as they can. Like, they'll sometimes feel like their chest is being puffed out, but like, get
Yeah.
that nice arch in your back, feel like you have good
Yeah.
posture. You just start kind of rocking back and forth. And as you're doing that, kind of get comfortable rocking back and forth. And once you do, just rock forward a little further until you get to the point where you feel like you're losing your balance. And at that point, just let your leg reach out and catch yourself.
Yeah.
And kind of practicing that before the start of a run can kind of get that kind of ideal forward lean. Um, then we kind of look at like their arms, and because a lot of times people, when they're running, they'll be thinking about swinging their arms, or they'll be told like, your arms move as fast as legs, so swing your arms fast, your legs will move faster. Or, you go to a cross country meet and you'll hear the coaches yell into the runners at the very end, like, swing your arms, swing your arms. And I always tell folks that that's kind of like half true, because you want your arms to be helping you, but you don't want to be swinging them forward, because if you're swinging your arms forward,
Yeah.
you're fighting the momentum.
Yeah.
So like, if you keep your arms nice and tight with like a tight angle at your elbow, and like pop your arms back, but then just relax and let them fall forward. Like, don't
Yeah.
swing them forward. And that popping back and falling forward actually helps them kind of stay in that tall posture that they started out in,
Yeah.
which is going to keep them in that kind of forward lean. Then the next thing I look for is what we just talked about, is like, where's that foot planting in relation to their knee? So we're looking for it to land underneath bent knee. And then ultimately the fourth point is just their cadence. A lot of this stuff gets cleaned up just with a higher cadence. So, most folks are going to want to be between like 170, 190 or so in their cadence. It usually, if it dips down like into the 160s, it's not always bad if they're like, everything's looking good in terms of their form. But if you get someone who's overstriding, they're sometimes down like in the low 160s, even into the 150s. And it's just because like you take those big strides where your foot's way out there. It's like you can only move your legs so fast. If you're taking up that much real estate per step, it's going to have a lower cadence. So if I can get them to tighten that up and kind of work up and get into like at least the 170s, a lot of times that overstride goes away because it's just too hard for them to reach that far out at that frequency.
Right.
So sometimes I'll just have them kind of count like how many times your right leg hits the ground in a 20-second interval, and then multiply that by 6, and then they can get a good idea of where they're at. And if they are really low, like at say 155, we try to like get them to practice getting up to maybe 165. And once they get comfortable there, we make another step up.
Yeah.
And kind of inch them up a little bit.
Do you work with people at all on modifying their stride length? Some people will take really short steps, and then the reverse is exactly what you just said, the overstriders who are like bounding through the air. What about people who take, they're just kind of like shuffling slowly along versus overstriders? Well, where would you find that kind of ideal balance of like, this is too small of a stride versus like, okay, you're going too far here?
Yeah, that's a good question. Usually when I see someone kind of like shuffling around like that, I sense it's, sometimes it's in just like kind of the slower population where it's like, they're just, they're fighting, like they're trying to lose weight as well and things like that. So that's all they have at the moment. But if I see that in someone who's like otherwise like fit and ready to go, I usually think it's just like, they probably have weak kind of, their hips are kind of weak. So they're not getting that knee drive.
Yeah.
So for those types of folks, what I'll a lot of times do is we'll move their workouts up onto an incline. So like they're doing like, rather than doing say like a short interval session on a track or on a flat stretch of road, I'll have them go and, do something on like even 8 to 10% incline. Cause then they're just in order to run fast up that, especially if they're fit, they have the engine to kind of really, really drive up that hill. That just gets that knee drive a little bit higher, and doing that over time, I think strengthens that area. Cause I think a lot of times when people are doing that, it's because that kind of upper area of their leg by their hip is just weak, and it's not allowing them to lift their leg up as high as it would normally go.
Yeah. Strengthening those hip flexor muscles to drive the knee through and pick yourself up there is really important. I know Ryan Flaherty again talks about trying to make as big of circles as you possibly can if you want to run faster, and big circles with your legs. I have just a couple more questions for you here that I'm interested to hear your take on. And one of them is about frequency, moving away from strength and mobility. But what about frequency of long runs preparing for an ultra? So, like what, if you're preparing for a 50 miler or a 100 miler, how many of your longest training runs are you gonna do?
Yeah, so if it's a 50 miler, sometimes I'll tease just a single long run. Usually once I kind of get up into the 100-mile distance and further than that, I'll start going into kind of like a 2 back-to-back long run, just to kind of get a little more volume, but without the injury risk of trying to say go out and run like a 40 or 50-mile training run or something like that. So in terms of how often, I usually build up to it for like the first 2/3 of the plan. And then about 6 weeks out from the taper is when I'll start kind of really focusing like that as like the key workout for the week, where I'm kind of backing off like intensity and a little bit of volume during the week in exchange for a little more volume on the weekend, and doing that. So that usually ends up being, depending on whether there's singles or doubles, anywhere between 6 to 12 of them. 12 is pretty aggressive. You usually don't need that many. And if you're coming off of like, a stretch of like, consistent running with no injuries and no like extended off seasons and things like that. Usually, I've done races where I've gotten away with as little as 4 weeks where I'm doing just like long runs on the weekends, and to get ready. So like usually depending on the person, depending on kind of where their strengths and weaknesses are, I'm usually talking about a 4 to 6 week range where we're going to go like very race specific and focus on those long runs as kind of the primary side of things.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So that's good to know that, it's that 4 to 6 range. And people, I think, always, and especially when coming into ultra, have no idea, like, if I'm going to run a 50 miler, does that mean I have to run 40 miles every single weekend or something like that? And it's like, well, probably not. It'd probably be a bad idea.
Yeah. And you could even do like one thing I think we're learning in the ultra community too, is like, especially with these hillier courses, there's great ways to train that long day on feet without actually getting the impact of running. So like a lot of mountain biking and stuff, it can be really useful to reduce that impact. Yeah. So you say you do like a 30 miler on Saturday, you can go out and do like a 2-hour mountain bike ride on Sunday and get off the impact, but still kind of get that like time experience. And some of that's more, I think, a psychological thing than anything. Just, when you're trying to wrap your head around how long you're going to be out there, it's a balance between fatiguing yourself to the point where you no longer want to do it anymore versus like having the relative experience to be able to do it and feel comfortable doing it, or is kind of the balance you're always playing with that last phase of the schedule.
Yeah. And, the cross training too, like mountain biking or any kind of cycling in general, is going to help build up those quads, those calf muscles, which will ultimately even just benefit your running. And especially mountain biking too, going up and down that hilly terrain is great for the quads. The last question that I wanted to ask you and hear your thoughts on is, if you were somebody who is coming into longer distance runs, someone who is athletic, knows how to run, like can handle longer runs, relative to a marathon, what would be like your main focus points to make sure that you're set up to be able to run an ultra marathon? I think that's one thing that people really, really struggle with, is like, how do I know if I'm even ready and or capable to do even a 50K, the start ultra?
Yeah. I think the interesting thing that I think is like, sometimes people, I think, get a little more, they get in a mindset where the longer the distance is, the harder it is to do. And it's just kind of a different type of experience. I actually think if you do everything right, one of the hardest races to do is probably the marathon, just because it's kind of this perfect balance of intensity and long or length that, like, if you overreach, you still have a lot of time to pay. But if you make a mistake, like, there's not a lot of opportunity to make it up at that pace. Whereas at 50 milers, you kind of have a little bit more of a flexibility where, like, I think there's a wider window of kind of how you pace something like that. So if someone's done like a fairly advanced marathon training plan, relative to their ability, they're definitely ready to take on, like I say, a 50 miler. The only difference is just going to be the way they kind of program and structure their training. And 50 miler is not going to be drastically different than the way I would train for a marathon. I'm definitely going to kind of skew away from some of the shorter, faster workouts a little earlier in the plan in exchange for a little more volume on like the long run. And then, maybe implement a back-to-back long run versus a single long run. But for like the 100 milers, that's where I think it does get quite a bit different, but it's not necessarily harder. It's just, I don't look, when I'm doing a 100 miler further, the intensity for that is so low relative to like a marathon that I'm doing like some of those typical marathon workouts in, like, say, 5K, 10K workouts in the first 2/3 of the plan. And then I'm phasing them out almost altogether. Minus maybe a little bit of threshold work, lactate threshold work, and, just focusing on the intensity at which I want to race at. So that's where I think people don't necessarily like have that knowledge of like how to kind of specify that for something as long as that. But in terms of their body being ready for it, I think it's just a matter of them saying, okay, this is what I want to do, and I'm going to give myself, 4, maybe 6 months to kind of prepare for it. And if they kind of do that program properly, they'll be ready to go.
Yeah. And would you say that the stuff that we've talked about earlier in this discussion, you know, the basic strength, the basic mobility, stuff like that would be other kind of prerequisites that would go into leading up for that? Assuming if you've done marathons and you haven't gotten hurt and you've survived them and all that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think it almost gets, it's probably even more important to a degree because you get to these like longer events and now it's like durability is just as important as,
Yeah,
you know, your fitness. Cause if you can't make it to the finish line, you know, in one piece, then it doesn't matter how fast or how fit you are.
sure.
So I think the strength work is even more important. And I think there's just, I mean, it's a little different because we just got a much bigger body of like participants in like the marathon and the Olympic
Right,
distance stuff. But
right.
it seems like with the ultra marathon stuff too, like you just see a wider range of just kind of like physiques at the like elite level versus like, you know, the marathoners when you get to the Olympic level, they all kind of look the same. The 5K runners always kind of look the same and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
But with like 100 milers and 24 hours, I mean, you get a pretty like, I mean, no one's out of shape, but like you get a little more variance between like one person to the next in terms of
yeah.
like kind of what their body type is.
Yeah. Yeah. I always tell my clients that, you know, stability is the name of the game. Like it's really just, can you last all of it? You already know how to run. It's going to
Mm-hmm.
your knees, ankles, hips, low back. Are those going to hold up? Is your posture going to hold up? And
Mm-hmm.
that's really what I tend to try and focus on. I'm glad to hear that you would kind of echo that in terms of training and building yourself up to do these longer ultras.
Yeah, yeah, because it gets interesting because it sometimes like I mean like that example I shared earlier where I was like leaning back at the end of the race is like that was incredibly inefficient. Like
Yeah.
I was running slower because I was doing that,
Yeah.
but it felt better to be in that position
Right.
because I had some imbalances and some weaknesses. So had I
Yeah.
had those non-running areas addressed, then I can hold that form longer, and then now all of a sudden that positioning isn't more comfortable, so
Yeah.
I'm getting kind of the best of both worlds where I'm efficient and feel most comfortable in the proper position.
Yeah. You know what? That made me think of just one last thing that I wanted to touch
Yeah.
on, and that was just general upper body posture. Posture in America and around the world, I'm sure in general, is just god awful. You know, the slouched shoulders and the hunched over kind of upper back. Is there anything, any kind of work that you specifically focus on to help keep your upright posture? Because I always tell my clients when I'm training them, if you can't hold your chest up, I call it like a proud chest. If you can't have a
Mhm.
chest while you're running and you start to hunch over, well, that hunched over is going to translate down into your body and create all sorts of crazy imbalances that are going to really, really be a detriment to you.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I think you know some stuff that I do is for one, I try to make sure I'm not sitting for too long at any point during the day. Like I have a
Right.
standing desk,
Yeah.
and if you can't get, if I mean not everyone has that option, so like usually I tell those folks like just try to make sure you're getting up periodically because
Mhm.
usually what'll happen is like you know as if you're sitting in your desk for like 2 3 hours, like you don't even notice that you're just gradually slunching over, and
Yeah.
then you kind
Hmm.
of forget that you're doing it. But if you're getting up occasionally and then you're sitting back down, you're kind of reminding yourself, okay, get back in that good posture. And then before you have a chance to really make it too egregious, you're getting up and kind of doing that again.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing I really like is just hanging. Like I'll do pull-ups and stuff, which I think helps too. But sometimes I'll just like, you know, I'll do a few pull-ups, but then I'll just hang there and just like really kind of let that back stretch out. And I
Yeah.
think that just kind of just kind of keeps that compression from kind of settling in and becoming comfortable,
Yeah.
where like if you kind of get comfortable with your spine kind of being elongated, it's a little easier to sit with that type of posture.
Yeah.
Um, and I think like I would do like if someone's really has a hard time with, I think some lower back work might be helpful. But kind of like we talked about before, if they're doing a good job with like their deadlifts and their squats and their lower body heavy lifting, they're probably getting their lower back worked pretty good anyway. But
Right.
um, if there's a reason to supplement, then that would maybe be the time.
Yeah, for sure. Well, hey, I really appreciate you talking with me. This was a lot of really good information. I'm really happy that we could do this. So, um, it's right about that hour time right here. So I know that you probably have some stuff going on that you need to get to. So I'll let you go here.
Awesome. Well, Jordan, thanks again for signing up. And if something pops in your head, shoot me an email. I'd love to stay in touch.
Yeah, definitely. I would really appreciate that.
Awesome. Take care. Have a good rest of the
Thanks.
day.
You too.
Bye bye.
Bye.